So this is something we all know, but delivering services is top of mind. Delivering services to customers in a highly available way is what we're all here and what we're all about within the IT domain. However, there's some consistent themes as we have conversations with customers in order to do this effectively. So there are really three key themes that I want to touch on. Again, I don't think any of this will be groundbreaking to anyone in this room, but it's a good level set for everything that this particular solution solves. The first is essentially visibility. So IT organizations typically have a pretty difficult time identifying within an application space and a business service what all the underlying infrastructure components are that make up that service. So answering a question like, if server X in my Los Angeles data center goes down, what business services are going to be affected? What users are going to be affected? That's actually a pretty tricky question to answer for a lot of enterprises. Secondly, and this, if you can see this, this particular outage is pretty well known, healthcare.gov, and the second concept that this really is meant to illustrate is one of availability. So availability is essentially all about root cause analysis. Maintaining an available infrastructure, an available service, is all about understanding how to react when issues occur. And if you don't have any visibility into the components that make up that service, it makes root cause analysis exceedingly difficult, and it makes predicting the impact of change exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. And the third tier, and I love the picture, is just this concept of service delivery. So with visibility and availability, that lends itself to service delivery. And delivery is all about time to value, time to market, the ability to automate and spin up new services quickly, the ability to essentially recover from service disruptions in a rapid manner. And essentially that's part and parcel to what we do and need to do as a service provider within IT, given the fact that if you don't do this well, you're essentially going to blow your SLAs, misalign customer expectations, introduce governance and compliance issues, and essentially not be providing the service that you're in business to provide, which will generally lead to higher instances of shadow IT. So having said that, there are a few underlying causes to these challenges, to these very common challenges. The first cause is essentially that within IT, you have a service management domain typically, whether it's formal or not, and you have an operations management domain. And these are two very siloed concepts and siloed organizations within most enterprises. So you have service management that's in business to execute processes operationally and really help keep that service-oriented mindset and keep services operational. And then within the operations management space, you really have individuals focused on keeping the infrastructure nimble, keeping the infrastructure aligned with business processes and business requirements as they change. So what oftentimes happens is, as you have your operations management hat on and you make configuration changes, you deploy new infrastructure, you're changing the underlying infrastructure, and that data is largely not fed to the service management side of the house. So as they try to establish root cause and remediate, they really don't have good data. They don't have good visibility into what it is they need to achieve. Now, from the other perspective, there's a customer, and a customer and IT really speak two very different languages. So from a business perspective in a common enterprise, you're going to have users that interact with an HR system. They're going to interact with a customer portal. They have a very specific perspective on the services that they consume as they execute their day-to-day activities. From an IT perspective, we're typically focused, again, from an infrastructure-centric point of view, whereas we're looking at servers, right? We're looking at widgets, we're looking at components, and there's generally this gap in translation between customers and IT resources when it comes to issues that are identified. So IT, as you can see, say, well, the drive's down, whereas the customer may perceive this to be, and will perceive this to be and identify it to be the fact that the portal is slow. So there's this gap in communication between the customer and IT, which leads to confusion and essentially the challenge in remediating issues effectively and efficiently. So how do we solve that? Well, the first step in solving that, and a key component to doing that and enabling IT to service the business from that standpoint, is creating what we call a service-oriented or service-aware CMDB. So the concept of a CMDB is probably nothing new to anyone in this room today, whereas it's essentially a roster, a database, if you will, of infrastructure components. The trick is with traditional CMDBs, they're typically unrelated components. So you have server A, server B, server C, network nodes, storage stacks, et cetera, that exist in isolation and aren't really mapped together and aligned to business services. So you essentially have a flat data model of widgets. And consuming that is, again, very difficult and doesn't allow you to pinpoint what's actually impacted and who is actually impacted. So a service-oriented CMDB essentially erases that, whereas within the CMDB, you create business services and you actually align and give context to all of the individual components of the infrastructure so that when an issue arises, when a user says the HR portal's slow, you can perform root cause analysis on the components that make up the actual service. And so how do you do that? How do you essentially establish this service-aware CMDB? So there's this concept known as service mapping, which isn't a new concept by any means, whereas in a traditional world, you would take a bottom-up discovery tool, sniff a bunch of IP ranges, discover infrastructure components, and again, populate them as flat records into a table somewhere. That got you some data, but it didn't correlate it to a business service, so it didn't provide the context that is really crucial to ensure availability. What we've seen and what we've partnered with ServiceNow on is this tool specific to the ServiceNow platform called Service Watch, and it takes a very different approach to this concept of service mapping that, again, goes beyond just identifying and discovering CIs, but actually mapping them together in a very unique way. And I'm going to touch on this very, very quickly because the demo is going to do a much better job than I can articulate here with these slides. But I just want to give some brief context as to how it works. So with the Service Watch tool, instead of basically doing a bottom-up discovery where you point at an IP range and see what shakes out, essentially you point at an entry point for an application. So an application is considered a business service. You point the tool at the entry point, and it actually does a top-down discovery and crawls all of the particular protocols for the application stack and the correlated infrastructure stack and populates not only the CIs, not only their attributes, but also the relationships specific to the application. So it's a very different and very unique approach to modeling these services. And what it does is it eliminates what we've run into in the past, whereas when we have just these CIs that aren't cobbled together and they're individual, when you try to map them manually, what essentially happens is it's very it consumes a lot of time, a lot of resources from different areas within the business. And frankly, by the time you're done figuring out how all of these things manually relate, something in the underlying infrastructure has already changed and you kind of have to start over. So you really need some sort of dynamic capability to monitor and meter the changes in the infrastructure as it relates to business services within a CMDB, and that's really what this tool excels at. As an example, and I just highlighted that, a service map is created, as we saw on the previous slide, and that will actually populate the CMDB and all of the relationships so that they can essentially be consumed from within your service management processes. So for example, once you have a service map established for the payroll service, for example, and those relationships established, that service map is populated and available from within your change management process in this example, and then you can determine who's going to be impacted when I do a change on a specific server, because we know that server relates to the business service of payroll, and we know the users that are associated with the payroll business service. So you can plan your outage windows accordingly, you can communicate to the impacted users in advance as opposed to retroactively, and everyone wins. So service mapping is great. Doing it in a top-down approach is very different and very meaningful and very beneficial as described. But it's really just a means to an end. And that end is really service assurance. So we're in the business to provide service. So we need to ensure that that service is whole and hale. Now, take a look at, this is a typical traditional CMDB, flat, no relationships, a lot of different widgets, a lot of different components, storage, network, compute, et cetera, as these isolated widgets in your configuration management database, as I've described. So from an availability standpoint, what happens in this model is you've got your event monitoring tools and your management tools kicking off alerts and kicking off events, some very critical, some not so critical, and they create a lot of noise, They create a lot of issues, and IT as an organization has a very, very difficult time separating true issues from white noise, essentially, and determining what should be prioritized and what should be executed upon to restore service. There's just a lot going on, and it's very difficult to manage, as I'm sure a lot of the people in this room know and experience probably on a day-to-day basis. Now, enter the service map and the service-aware concept where you have these individual widgets these individual configuration items aligned to a business service, well, that changes things. That changes things quite a great deal. You're going to still have these event monitoring alerts coming in, but they're going to have context, right? They're going to come in on server A. They're going to come in on storage array B. Storage array B is going to be correlated to that payroll business service, so you're going to know from a root cause standpoint, we know who's impacted immediately. We know where to go start looking to remediate and restore service rapidly. So what that also does is it limits, as you see there on the right, the number of issues or incidents that are created, because you can also correlate those alerts and events not only to the CI, but to a specific single incident that can be managed, as opposed to dozens and dozens and dozens, where again, you have to cull through them and determine which is true, which needs to be prioritized accordingly, which can just be closed out of hand. And essentially, restoring that instance, subsequently restoring the service, gets you where you need to be and back to a high availability state. And that essentially lends itself to just this concept of a single pane of glass for monitoring business service health, as you can see here, and Tulio will dive into this much more deeply. But all of this service mapping, relationship building, and ongoing dynamic maintenance of these as the infrastructure changes is really enabled and is able to be metered and monitored through a single pane of glass, as you see before you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tulio to really take over the interesting part of this presentation and really do a deep dive into ServiceNow and ServiceWatch. And this is essentially predicated on a few use cases that we've created and a fictitious aviation company, we call it Head Aviation, with respect to a new service that they're about to roll out and some challenges that their business service owner has encountered and created along the way so that we can help them get back where they need to be. Tulio?
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Joe. So first, going to talk a little bit about ServiceWatch and how ServiceWatch maps services and some differentiators there, and then we'll go into a couple of use cases. So as Joe left off here, we have a service assurance dashboard that, from an operations perspective, instead of, what do we typically see in a manager of managers from an event perspective is we usually see a Christmas tree, right? A lot of red colors, yellow, blue, et cetera, but really no correlation on what to prioritize. And events are typically very transitive. So the events come in, you don't know really what's being affected, and they kind of all more or less have the same priority, or you focus on the priority one or high severity events. With ServiceWatch here, we're actually seeing a kind of a Windows tile view of the health of your services. So as events are coming in to ServiceWatch, we're actually correlating that up to what service is being impacted. One of the challenges we see in a lot of discovery and mapping tools is that quite often in your enterprise application architecture, you've built in a lot of redundancy. Right, you've got load balancers, you've got clustered servers, you have database clusters, et cetera. Your monitoring tools typically aren't aware of that. However, with an up-to-date service map, when events come in, we can actually correlate that to a farm. So if you have 5 web servers in your farm and one of them goes down, the priority for that event shouldn't be priority 1, it should perhaps be a lower priority, and we're able to do that because of the map. So here's our customer purchase order service, and it really starts with an entry point, right? So I'm just going to click, this is the entry point here. We can see over here it's actually a URL/trade, and the way you configure mapping to actually happen is it all starts with that entry point. The seed is not a IP address range. The seed is, in fact, how does your customer, how does your employee engage with that service, right? That's how we actually tie it down to the business. In this case, it's an HTTPS service. It could be a Citrix endpoint. It could be a WAR file, et cetera. There's 100 so different entry points that we have patterns for. So in this case, it's an HTTPS entry point. And let me just zoom in a little bit more. And what we do, instead of traditionally just looking at network traffic, we actually read the configuration files. So what we'll do at that first entry point is we'll get the FQDN or the IP address for that HTTPS entry point, and then we'll determine that's typically going to be a web server or a load balancer. We'll actually then log onto that load balancer, and more commonly we see F5s. So we'll actually log on to the F5s. We'll look at, say, where does /trade route me to? There may be some iRules, et cetera. So we'll say, actually, it's routing me to 5 different IP addresses. And then we'll say, okay, well, those 5 IP addresses, let's now log on and authenticate against those 5 IP addresses. So in this case here, we've got an Apache server So we logged onto the Apache server, and instead of cluttering this map with the various components of a service. So what makes up a service? It's the application stack, it's the hypervisor, it's storage, and it's the network. But if you were to clutter that all on one map, your map would almost be unusable. So as I look at a service here and I look at this application, I can see that here's my Apache server. It's running on a OS server here, but also this happens to be virtualized, and I can get information from my hypervisor. Right? So within one view, I can see the different various components of the stack. And I've also looked at my impact rules. Because we know that we've got a farm here, a farm of Apache servers, we can create impact rules. So let me just switch over to the service that we're going to be using for our demo today. So we're going to be using a head aviation application. This is actually fired up. We're using CloudFormation and through ServiceNow to fire this up in AWS. Here's a model app. We actually have one in production. So let's take a look at this service that's in production. The difference between this service and the one we saw previously is this actually has 3 Tomcat servers. What's nice about service mapping is it's not, once we discover a service, we'll continue to rediscover that service at a pretty high interval. So as components are added to your map or removed from your map, it keeps it up to date near real time. So in this case, we have 3 application nodes here. How did we get there? So if I click on my history here, right, I can take a look at what's changed in this environment, and I'm just going to set my entry points and say, let me compare the map. And I have some red here, which means we had some incidents come into the system. And in this case, we had incidents come into the system because we have a support system, support desk in the east. We added one to the west, but we didn't advise anybody that we needed additional capacity. So events started coming into the into Service Watch, right? So let me just take it one more time. Let's map this over here and hit compare, right? And fit the screen. And we'll see here that we actually added additional nodes, right? So operations fired up, the default model was 1 server. When we needed additional capacity, we added two additional nodes. And that's really important when you do root cause analysis. What's changed? Not only additions, but subtractions. So let me switch over. So we've kind of been in a service mapping mode. Let me switch over to the service owner mode. So now I'm in as the business service owner for the head aviation application, right? So I'm looking at this from a kind of a 360 view of this service. So it's not just about the map anymore. It's about how that map enables me to manage this service that I have customers and employees consuming. So in this dashboard here, I can see any change records or incident records that have occurred for this particular service. So I have some closed changes and incidents because of my outage of when we expanded the support desk. I can see the current state of the service. It's green and available. However, we have had some issues in the last 30 days. Another KPI may be, as we have added users to the service, and we see this band here of users, we started to see an increase in response time, indicating that we needed at some point to add additional compute power. From a service desk perspective, from a supports perspective, SLA perspective, we're doing quite well, right? We're meeting our SLAs. I can see my actual services here. And then also just for the millennials out there, we have kind of a Twitter, Facebook type feed into the service. So if someone, I don't know if the millennials like to open a ticket anymore, so I'm going to come into my Twitter feed and say I have an issue. So it's kind of a 360 view for this particular service. So after the last outage as a service owner, right, I didn't tell ops that we were adding another support center. So what they added to my dashboard was the ability for me to request additional capacity through a service catalog should we have a market event. And we happen to have a market event that's about to happen. We're about to go, no more customer support desks. We're actually going to start to offer online booking. So I'm really excited. We're going to offer online booking, and now I'm going to actually request additional capacity for my aviation app. So this isn't smoke and mirrors. We're actually going to hit this service catalog item, and I am going to request additional capacity for over 5,000 users for my application. And what this is going to do is what we've actually front-ended is a CloudFormation template, right? So we've got a stack that's in CloudFormation, and we're going to add additional horizontal compute nodes in order to support the additional users. So I'm going to hit order now in my service catalog. And I'm requesting additional capacity here. So I'm just going to, it lets me know that it's been submitted. Because this was actually marked as a production service, we're not going to want it, even though automation's great and I can add additional capacity, we actually have a rule within the system that says if a system is marked as production, create a change record, right? And use the same workflow to create the change record. We already knew we were adding additional nodes, so let's make it really easy for the team to approve this. Why go to the operations team and say create a change record, have the system automate creating that change record, and it simply needs to be approved. So here's my change record here that says a request for updating the aviation stack. Let's take a look at that change record and quickly approve it. So here's my change record. Got automatically assigned to the aviation administrators. We're going to add some additional nodes here. I can check for conflicts. I can calculate risk. This is really a nice union between, traditional service management and kind of agile operations. I can take a look at the actual CloudFormation stack. That's where we made the change to. So I take a look at this stack here, and I can, just to geek out, I can actually see, the JSON that we're actually going to use to push over, and I'm just going to proceed with this change. So a couple clicks. Notice no one actually had to type anything in. This could have gone to a brick and mortar type CAD, a dynamic CAD to approve this. But the key here is that we were able to, automate creating the change record because change management is still relevant in the world of Agile. So I'm going to proceed with this change here. And once this is actually moves forward and it's actually kicking off our integration into AWS, and we're actually going to start to update that stack. So I'm pretty excited now. We got this deployed. I did what operations asked me to. Now we're going to fast forward a couple days to now that the service is live. So let me scroll down here and actually see. As part of my live feed, we actually had, when service alerts came in, we actually have it right to that feed, right? So we can traditionally have incidents, but we also started to enter them in the air. So it looks like our operations tool is telling us that we're running out of resources on MySQL. We also have our application performance management tool telling us that we have some slow transactions. Those came from a system. Now we're actually starting to see users reporting issues. So clearly we modified the stack, we deployed it, and now we're starting to have issues. So as a service owner here, I'm just going to reply back and say we are working with operations on this now, and submit this. So as a service owner, I have a pretty good view into my service, and I actually know right now that it's not in the best state. And if I'm just going to take a refresh this, I see incidents now coming in, and I also see that the health of my service is pretty bad, right? I've got a degradation of service. And degradation of services are probably the trickiest things to treat from a root cause perspective. I'll take a binary up-down outage any day versus a performance one. So I'm going to switch hats now. I've kind of been in the service owner mode. I'm going to switch hats now and go into the operations mode. So from an operations perspective, I'm going to have basically an event management console. So in my event management console, I have events coming in from multiple sources. I have them coming in from ServiceWatch, Nagios, SolarWinds, et cetera. I have events coming in. Here are my 2 events for this particular service. I have my APM tool told me there was an issue. But I also have this MySQL issue here that created an incident. But I want to click on the alert because I want to find out more about this alert that came in from my monitoring tool. So when I take a look at this alert, right, this alert comes in, it basically, I can see the event that caused this. I have a knowledge-based article that I'll take a look at in a moment, but it also tells me that while that event came in for a MySQL box, upstream, the service that was actually being impacted was the aviation production service. When I click on this service here, I can take a look at the business service map. So I'm going to click on the business service map here. And I'm looking at the CMDB now, a CMDB that was populated from our service mapping tool. And I can see some of these elements have yellow ones around them. So I'm kind of going to go into, root cause analysis mode, right? And if I click on this MySQL server here, I can see that I've got 2 incidents came in. I have an alert and I have an event that came in. So traditionally in root cause analysis, you're saying, what changed in my environment? So from this view here, I can start to do some root cause. I can take a look at this Tomcat server over here that actually has a change record associated with it. So if I take a look at this, it's like I have an open change to patch Tomcat. So I can open up this change record and I can see that we're actually affecting, 5 CIs are being updated. I can look at when this change was planned, risk calculation, et cetera. So from a root cause perspective, being able to layer on top of your service incidents and problems, et cetera, is quite valuable. So now that let me go back to my event console here. Sorry. Go back to my event console. I noticed that I had a knowledge base article associated with that event. So I'm going to open up my knowledge base article here and just take a look at this article. And we can see here some troubleshooting that we can have, right? Usually when you have multiple monitoring tools, your monitoring tools will give you 4,000 character fields for you to put instructions, et cetera. Having them all within the same platform, a knowledge base article gives you quite a bit of value. So according to this, it's telling me that actually I can fix this issue by increasing my memory buffer pool. So before I do that, I just want to kind of switch over to service watch mode and take a look at this service, right? So I'm going to come back over to service watch, and we'll actually see that before this service had 3 Tomcat servers associated with it. So when we actually deployed the additional capacity and it got deployed to AWS, it actually initiated Service Watch to go in and rediscover that service, right? So instead of traditionally keeping that map up to date and going in manually done, the map is kept automatically up to date through rediscovery. So here I'm looking at my map here now. I can see I have 4 Tomcat servers. And I can also look at my MySQL server here and click on it, root cause, and see this is red. So I'm clearly seeing that the issue right here is my MySQL server. And, I'm in operations and I know database contention. It looks like we added a bunch of horizontal compute power, but we didn't actually size the database in the right way. So I've got to address this MySQL challenge. So I'm going to go back to my knowledge base article in here. And what this knowledge base article is actually telling me is that I happen to be a bleeding edge customer that uses Chef and Puppet as a configuration automation tool. And it seems here that we actually have set up node groups that allow us that when we place a node inside a node group, we will automatically configure the device. So I've got an extra large sized node group here. So I'm going to click on this MySQL group here. And my MySQL group extra large actually has a configuration. This is tied into Puppet. So we have native integrations with both Puppet and Chef. We can take in manifests and recipes, bring that into ServiceNow, and actually apply change control to that. So in this case, I actually want to get this server into my production pool. So I'm going to hit edit in here, and I am going to search on my database server. And I'm going to bring over these 2 Tomcat servers. And what this is going to do is it's going to place this in the node group, and then it's going to kick off a workflow to apply this configuration. Real world, you could have also had a change record associated with this, right? So just like we had a change record associated with deploying the production, updating the AWS stack, you may want to have a change record whenever you apply a new manifest or recipe to a device. So now that I've applied this, I'm just going to switch over to Service Watch. I can see that my events were cleared on the Service Watch side and green. I'm going to take a look as the service owner. And on the service owner side, we're going to see that the incidents were automatically resolved, the health of the service is back up, and I already have a happy consumer that's telling me we're back in business. So that was a lot of demo in, I think, 20 minutes or 15 minutes, but hand that back over to you, Joe. So.
Thank you, Tulio. So we'll just close with this slide because I think this is very important. From a maturity standpoint, everyone in this room is essentially at a different point on the curve, right? So there are some organizations that are, to Tulio's point, are bleeding edge and are already chef and puppet shops and doing configuration automation and are ready for essentially something that may fall in a phase 3 stack here with respect to the strategy and maturity level. Some organizations may not have any automation, may not have any orchestration, may not have any service mapping capabilities today, and need to essentially just establish a service management platform to start and build from and layer these concepts of a serviceware CMDB enabled by service mapping and service assurance, which would be more of a phase 1. So there's definitely a continuum here with respect to where everyone sits today. To Tulio's point, we obviously showcased a bit more of maturity to show the power of the platform and the power of the tool and the benefits that essentially allow us to achieve those business objectives that we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation. So I'd like to close on this, and that is Service Watch by ServiceNow.